Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. And the clapping's done. Anthony Atamanuik is the star and creator of The President Show, which, for my money, is the smartest satirical news show to come since Stewart's incarnation of The Daily Show. On April 3rd, you can see the first of two of his specials airing. The first is the Make America Great-A-Thon. Let's take a look at a clip from the show.
Are these wings spicy? Are you ready?
Yeah, let's go.
When Comedy Central asked me what I wanted to do next as their biggest star, I had no idea what to say. So I said, telethon. And then I screamed, telethon! It combines the two things I love most, television and taking people's money. Not to mention thongs.
No, it's thon, there's no G.
Ooh, time's up for panties. It really is the year of the woman. So join me for Make America Great-A-Thon, a President Show special. On April 3rd, we're gonna raise money for all the great things that you can buy with money. Ugh, these are too hot.
Everybody, please welcome Anthony Atamanuik.
Hello. Those chicken wings were disgusting.
Where were they from?
They were from some place around the corner, and they were like mostly grease and very little chicken. So you saw that ring of grease was not makeup. It was just nasty chicken grease.
How long did you have to do? Were you able to do that pretty quickly, or was that like a...
I think we did it 3 times. So I was pretty sick.
I mean, did you improvise that? Because you improvise a lot of a lot of stuff that's on the show and the special and promos, I think too.
Yes, I would. Promos, no, because they need to be to time. So, although I feel like time's up for panties, I think I might have made up on the spot. Just because I thought that would be a gross thing for Trump to say. Yeah, we. All of our web stuff is generally improvised. So like we have one that I think we put out yesterday, which is like a phone booth one where I like call.
That's the one that I saw. Yeah,
John Barron, and I guess I called him Dennis Dennison as David Dennison, but Trump would make that mistake. But we shot that one take. I improvised all of it, and it's a lot of fun. We love doing all of the web stuff because it's like easy and free form. And one of our producers, 2 of our EPs, Christine Nangle and Jason Ross, have played the voice of God, like off camera. And we have like a mini narrative where like Jason's character got thrown out of the plane, like View to a Kill, and then Christine took over, but then now Christine moved to another show, so Jason's back on our show, so we like justified how he climbed back on the plane. Nobody knows, nobody cares, but we do it for ourselves.
Well, that's one of the things that I think makes the show so much fun, is that outside of the political satire, outside of the great impression you do, which I don't even really like using the word impression for what you do with Trump, you've really made him his own character.
I think impression's fine, actually, and I'll tell you why. Impersonation I'm not a fan of, because impersonation, and it's not that I'm not a fan of it, it's like impersonation is a specific skill. It's a skill of being almost exactly like, uncannily like a person, in the rote movements, voice, and all that behavior. Impression is the act of, it's what the term is, which is that you're taking the notion of somebody, the essence of a person, and you're interpreting them into a character. So you're essentially making them sort of a hybrid of the person they are and your interpretation of who they are. So I don't mind impression as a term.
What is the essence of Trump for you?
I think the essence of Trump, to me, is I think a survivor of abuse, clearly. I think a very scared, self-loathing element combined with a brash and complete disregard for anything around them outside of the bubble of who they are. So when you combine the sort of childhood need for love and appreciation combined with a complete contempt for people, you have a recipe for a really sort of borderline personality. And so I think that
people have suggested it might be an actual diagnosis of him, which is important.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard because, it's very hard without knowing, someone's psychology to really get into it. But I would say that most likely there is a borderline personality. There is probably somewhat of a histrionic personality disorder. And histrionic personality disorder is when a person tends to be publicly and out to strangers, almost like have an intimacy. And if you notice his rallies, he feels an extreme intimacy in these rallies of like 10,000 people or whatever. And also, this is a very interesting one, sexual inappropriateness with family members. So he has a bizarre nature sexually, and I mean, we now know that he has said to many women, "You remind me of my daughter," and in addition has, done his own knee touching, and I would date her. So he fits that profile of a narcissistic person who feels close with people when they're in groups, and when they're in person, they are just an extension of himself, and I'm hypersexually inappropriate. And those things all fit him. So that would be my armchair diagnosis.
That's your armchair diagnosis. And
Yeah.
how does that feed into your impression of him?
I mean, it's hard, it's sort of like how do you drive a car?
It's kind of from the gut.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've done it for so long now, it's hard for me to break down what it is anymore, but I think if I sort of was to earmark it in very surface ways, it's like I like to take a little sort of like someone's interpretation of what they think a Frank Sinatra or a Dean Martin would be, combined with a bit of Homer Simpson, and then mix that with almost like a touch of Jack Benny, which for this crowd, none of you know what I'm talking about. But like, I think that he's very old school, and in addition, he has a sort of even more old school vibe to him, like a very sort of 60s, 70s sort of, when the cool folks in the 40s were aging out but still appearing on Merv Griffin and stuff. That's how I see him. Yeah, and I think that like also all I have to do is really turn on the part of my mind that's like a magpie or a parrot, where like you're just whatever the thing is in front of you, that's the thing. Okay, that's now the thing, and I think that's how he is. And I think the other one is that he has a deep relationship with himself. If you watch him speaking, he's talking to himself. So there's two selves there, and he checks in with that self and actually comments to it. So if you ever watch him do a press conference, he's not really talking to the people. He's actually talking to another version of him, and then through that, he is then talking to people. But
That's where the kind of like constantly interrupting himself and throwing like adverbs in on something that is totally unnecessary,
Yes.
right? Like
Yeah.
he says something and then all of a sudden you can see something happen, click in his head, and he's like, and it's very good. It's
because he's
very,
stalling.
very good.
But that's what he is he's like, if he's like, we have big steel, the steel's so good, and we're working on the steel. And it's a big plant. It's a great plant, and they make so many great things. And you guys are working, right? You're working hard, right? Hard work. And you guys need work, and work is what we're going to get. And jobs. Jobs is great. We're going to make jobs, steel jobs. China's terrible. Jobs. And that's what he does. It's like poetry. I mean, in a way, you could probably take what he says and break it down, and they'd make weird poems. But he's always stalling for time. There was a moment recently where he was with like steelworkers or something, and this guy came up and talked about how his dad lost his job and he couldn't afford to pay for the 6 kids and all this. He goes, but now I've got a job, and thank you, Mr. Trump, whatever, and my dad would be so proud of me, right? And Trump walks up to the podium and he goes, your dad's looking down on you from heaven. And he's so proud of you. And the guy turns and goes, my dad's still alive. And Trump turns and without missing a beat goes, well, then he's way more proud of you then, because, he's still around. And in that, in the news, and this is my favorite thing about can I swear?
Yeah, you can swear.
The fucking media is that, there is this terrible desire to attach to anything he says and sort of spin it into this is why he's terrible, right? And to me, it's such softball, garbage, first pass journalism, which is if you just do that, then it's a malaise of all things are bad and everything doesn't make sense, and it actually makes it into a wash where nothing matters. My personal belief is there's a design in that, which is we want to be upset with him, we want to not like Trump, and it's surreal that this sort of bizarre figure somehow became the president of the United States, but they are profiting so deeply off of him that the idea of him going away is worse. Because, there are truths in what Trump says, and I am not a Trump supporter by any stretch if you watch the show, but That doesn't mean that he doesn't say true things.
Well, he says so many things at once that he obviously is going to stumble into a truth every now and then.
Yes, I agree, but he does. But he has a very specific point that is true. He makes a lot of money for the media, and he does. He makes a lot of money. Anyone, I'm not going to name who it is, but we had someone at our show who had worked at MSNBC right when this popped, and the president came down and said, "I want Trump on that front webpage every day." Okay? When in the history of the United States have we allowed a presidential candidate to have unfettered, unchecked coverage of their rallies day in and day out? Never. So if we all, a lot of us who are left thinking or right thinking, but reason thinking, don't like the state of what's going on, to put Trump as the only figurehead, as the golden calf that we're all going to go, this is the thing that we hate worship, then we're missing the point, which is that there's a heist going on by major media companies and by the both parties. Everyone is getting away with so much because they can blame him. And it's not to say that he's not out of his mind and in my opinion, not fit to be president, but there's, Mitt Romney today said he'd be harder on DACA. So, we're all, forgetting that there's this whole other world of candidates. I mean, when we're talking about, we impeach him and get what? Mike Pence?
Well, and that's the thing.
I mean, it's crazy how we're thinking. And so the media, just to finish this point, is that the media coverage, they latch onto that and go, Trump, misspoke about person's, dead dad, and it sounds so awful, and you watch it and you go, okay, who cares? Basically, he recovered actually quite deftly. So you got to give it to somebody. And the one thing anyone who's read Sun Tzu is know your enemy and respect them. Don't sit there and just think they're a fool. That's how they stay in power. And I think we're making a huge mistake kind of globally in our thinking about how to get rid of this person or how to defeat the deeper ideology of the conspiracy of marketing consumerism and the media class and what it's doing to us. It's dividing and putting us into consumption pockets that keep us perpetually distracted from the fact that we're dismantling the country.
Everybody give a round of applause for that because it's the most true thing anyone said on this stage in a long time.
Oh, thank you.
And I will say...
I like the prompt, too.
Yeah, I do feel like I had to tell them because I think there's a couple of people
yeah, I'm quite boring.
I do think, but everything that you've just said is why I really love the President Show. Because I find the President Show's humor and satire to be wrapped up in this message a lot of the times.
Yes.
Obviously with more jokes. But,
yes, yeah.
But I find that with a lot of the other late night shows and, without bashing any of them, they are so wrapped up in doing the same thing that CNN or MSNBC is doing, which is just bashing Trump and not having a sort of greater conversation or a greater satire about the system as a whole, which I think somehow you've been able to take this impression that you did as a lark initially, right? And have been able to turn it into what I think is the most sort of salient political commentary happening on television right now.
Well, it was all by design. Yeah. No, I think that I was doing a lot of sort of social satire stuff at the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater at the UCB in New York for years in a show I used to do with my friend John Gemberling, who plays Steve Bannon on our show.
Wonderfully.
And he played Bevers on Broad City. And, John and I set out to do sort of this, cynical show, kind of taking apart when people sort of get their feathers ruffled, especially on social media, sort of taking apart that outrage and seeing what's in it, like what's legit, what's not legit about it. And I think over years of doing that and doing a weekly show and cutting our teeth, and then when he moved to LA, cutting my teeth, of just, coming up with an idea, dumping it out in a day, and figuring out how to make it work, and then moving on. When we got to this Trump thing, I did the same thing with the show, is I did Trump in an ASCAT, which is the flagship show of the UCB, and my friend Shannon O'Neill, the artistic director, said, why don't you write a show? I wrote it in a week, and that became essentially the foundation for all of this. And a lot of what I wrote in that show actually made it into the TV show, which was kind of, I will say for myself, pretty prescient. But I think that I figure that if you're going to make really serious sort of points with gravitas or complexity, your best bet is to make a really, really almost silly, farcical show. So the thing we like to do is really make him a fool. We have some pretty almost old school setup punch jokes in it. I like, having him have a tantrum on the floor. I like watching Trump pile in burgers because I also like to eat burgers, so I'm like fine with that. So we want to sort of like, that's the Homer Simpson kind of quality of it, is like make him silly, make him truly the silly everyman, and then punctuate those things with real satirical points. And I learned that over the tour with James Adomian and Trump versus Bernie was that a little spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. Is like if you make people feel like, okay, this is like somewhat silly or somewhat playful, and then you deliver a real message underneath, people are more willing to take it. I think you're right. It's difficult when there is a lot of shows that are all sort of understandably trying to represent the sort of panic and fear of what's going on and sort of perpetual, like, what is happening. But I think eventually, hopefully, those shows will start transitioning into acceptance. Like, there are 5 stages of grief, and you can't just stay in denial forever. You've got to, like, move through all of them. And I do think that, Seth Meyers, I really think his show does a top-notch job. I mean, to name, someone, I think they are doing an incredible job with Trump satire. He's done very good work with sort of doing these like long form litigations of him, and so I admire that. Maybe it's just because a lot of his staff works on our show. No, I'm kidding.
Just keep them coming over.
Yeah,
keep
just
it like
keep them coming. I get my
revolving
hair
door.
cut there, so I got to be nice. No,
Is that true?
yeah.
How are you affiliated with the Seth Meyers show? How did that happen?
Well, I have friends who write over there, and I'm friends with Seth and Pete Grosz, our executive producer, who plays Mike Pence. He used to write over there.
Right.
Betty is my white wig person, is the hair person there. And it's a small world in production, so you have a lot of people all intersecting through a variety of different things. So.
How do you guys at the President Show avoid the trappings of hitting this sort of day-to-day, even when you were just, I know that your series of specials going into the new year.
This is what we're doing, yes.
But even before, when you were a weekly show, how did you avoid the trappings of doing like, this is what happened this week, isn't this crazy, isn't this crazy?
I think that we did sort of 3 models, which is I saw the series as books. So each season, in my estimation, would be a sort of a book, not to use the Bible, but like a biblical book. So you would sort of have a beginning and an end that sort of finished one idea of what the show was that season. And then, we're now doing these specials, so it's a sort of converted version of a season. We'll sort of approach, we have to make somewhat changes just because of the nature of how the show is being done now. But the idea being that we close a chapter on one version of who he is, and although we retain ideas from that first season, we want to sort of revisit a new angle of who he is, and also what the system is that's around him that is sort of propping up or taking apart who he is. So we would always write right up to the taping so that we could make sure to put contemporary stuff in, but we had the long form narrative of, in our world, the president really believes that Fireside Chats should be a late night show. So we're showing that. But then in addition, I always wanted to have there be the question of, is any of this happening? Is this all him disassociating? And our show is a representation of his disassociation, of what's going on in his mind when he watches a late night show, eating a hamburger in the presidential bedroom. So we sort of wanted to play with the idea of like, is it real? Is it not real? What's inside his mind? What's outside his mind? Which we continue to do in this special. And I think that way, the interviews were really important too, because that's when we got people in who could use me as a therapy dummy, and they could say what they want to say to Trump and get it out in a real way. And you'd be surprised how many non-actors were so easily able to go along and commit to it. And then I would use that opportunity in the interview to drop the mask a little bit and say 1 or 2 statements that are, from my perspective, not really from Trump's. which is also funny to watch come out of his mouth. And
The interview with Matt Taibbi is absolutely hilarious because he's blown away that you keep dropping the mask and saying these things that are kind of in line with Matt Taibbi's view of the world.
Yes.
And also very smart and good points, and
thank
not
you.
from Trump's point of view of the world.
Well, I think it's fun to do that because in the tour we would do that, and I found that what would happen in the tour is, you know, again, listen, I'm a little older, so I'm an older lefty from Massachusetts. So
Where in Massachusetts are you from?
Chelsea, Mass.
Okay.
Chelsea by the Sea. A very poor city outside of Boston. So nobody knows about it. And if you do know, whenever you tell someone from Boston that you're from Chelsea, they go, oh, or they grab for their wallet. And I'm not kidding you. So I learned on the tour, I mean, listen, I firmly believe this in terms of Trump thinking anyway, and if you watch this show, hopefully a message of our show is we need to clean our own house. Like if you're in the left, if you're a Dem, we need to think about, you know, in a relationship when things fail, you don't go and just look at the partner and blame them if you want to learn anything. The whole idea is for you to look about who were you and why were you in that state, and what did you contribute to or what was not you. You have to divide all those things out. And I really do feel on the left, I think the bubble hasn't broken. I think we're still fully living in that bubble. I think we're in complete denial of the state of the world. We can't just erase 40 or 50 million people in this country. I mean, there's been attempts on other continents to do things like that. It didn't play out too well. So we are going to have to eventually reconcile with the fact that there is a part of this country that we don't see eye to eye with on a lot of things. And of that 50 or 60 million people, not all of them are the Charlottesville people. You know, there's a lot of them who are in the middle. And also, the notion that white supremacy does not exist on the left is crazy. White supremacy is an American notion. It's a global notion, but I mean, America, I mean, we are fully in a white supremacist environment. All of us who are white are participating in it every day. And you don't get to exclude yourself from it because you believe you think correctly. You are a participant anyway, right? So just to make sort of a point. So if you're in the show and I'm trying to deliver hard points like this, I would find especially left-leaning audiences did not want to hear it, did not want to hear about their participation in the dynamic that subjugates people. They just want to know that someone else is the bad guy. And that's a very big problem.
Huge problem. I mean, I don't mean to absolve myself, but I prefer hearing those points most of the time because just going after Trump eventually gets tiresome. Thank you so much. But I do think that, you know, creating Trump as the villain and just going after him, and like you said, going back to the thing at the steel plant, you know, and attacking these stupidities of his, it does absolutely nothing.
What does it solve? I mean, my thing is, what does it solve?
Trump came from something.
Trump
he became president for a reason.
It came from the abdication of responsibility of both parties, which have become nothing but a House of Lords and a group of people who rotate in and out of the system to learn the system so they can go into private work and manipulate it for the purposes of shoring up more money. And in the meanwhile, you have real society. I mean, someone got shot today. A black man got shot today in the street because his pants were down around his ankles. He had mental illness. That is where we're at. And we love to talk about that in the media, and we like to say how upsetting it is, but who is really making the motion, action, or notion to do anything? Who on the left do you see? Who in the Democratic Party is really, truly, either is the party giving a platform to them to make these points, or are coming up to make these points? So we have real root issues. Like, people think, do we think that racism began when Trump ran for president? Do we think the subjugation of women began when Trump became president? Do we think that the inequality in our economy and earnings versus cost of living, that's 45 years. That's 50 years of this arc occurring. And the idea that we're all falling for the bait that this guy, but not this guy, is the reason that all these things are happening is nuts. Because then you know what's going to happen. It's going to be like Saddam, right? They're going to tear the statue down of Trump in 2020, right? Let's say he loses, which
tribal fighting.
Right? And what's going to happen is everyone's going to go, we got rid of the boogeyman. This is what we did in 2003. We got rid of Saddam. It's all fine, right? Which, of course, was insane anyway. But what's going to happen instead is you're going to have two parties fill that vacuum and go, now we're really going to change stuff. And it's going to go right back to the same garbage of the mitigated, slow bleed of your ability to live and to survive. And they know that the way to maintain that is to dump as many docs on Netflix and to put as many things on this little light delivery device and to convince you that social justice is done with your thumbs. And last time I checked, no one marched in Selma on their thumbs. People had to show up. And that's what I love about the centennials, I love about these young people, is they're actually going into the street. People are going into the streets. And that's what's going to happen, is there's going to have to be a generation of people who are willing to put themselves really out on the line for the awful thing of the violence and the pushback that happens when you want to push social change. And the more masses of people who do that, the more effective we'll be. And that means pushing against your own party. People forget, those social justice movements happened under Democratic presidents who were more connected in the 60s to that movement than the Republican Party was at the time. And so when the Southern Democrats split, the reason that Johnson was motivated to do the Civil Rights Act was because of the pressure that was put on him. Kennedy made a decision that ruined his trip to visit Khrushchev because of the pressure that happened at the grassroots when Robert Kennedy had to send in the National Guard to protect Martin Luther King and the Freedom Riders. So the question being, do we have the guts to go against our own people that we align ourselves with? Or are we just going to continue this us versus them boogeyman thing that doesn't do any good for anybody? And that's what I think. Sorry, that's so not funny. But the show's funny, guys. The show's so funny.
Do you want to punctuate that with a quick Trump impression, just to make matters funny?
The world's going to end in a ball of fire.
Who's got a question?
Hi.
Hi.
So I was wondering.
What's your name?
Oh, I'm Randy.
Randy?
Randy with the E.
Rennie.
Randy.
Randy.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm Anthony. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I was wondering. What was I gonna ask? Oh yeah. Yes. Was there ever a time on the show where your character of Trump got way too real that you had to think, wait, let me push back and go back to the comedic route of your character?
That's interesting. That's a very good question. I would say that it happens less in character because that's actually when I'm most in comedy mode. So I'm most like thinking like, don't ever dip too. I mean, there are takes where like I might go a bridge too far in improvising something and be like, oh, that's gross. Like, let's not do that, right? And in the beginning of the show, we had a rule we started to build around the show, which was that Trump is a loaded gun and only we know how to fire it, which is probably a bad metaphor now, but it was a good back then. It's a hard thing to write for because we had two rules at the show, or three rules, which is that we can't prostitute the LGBT, the women's or the people of color movements or groups in this country because we're doing Trump. So I think a lot of Trump humor is like, oh, this is our chance to be racist. This is our chance to be sexist because Trump is those things. So we can get away with doing it, right? And I think there's an inclination, especially with, I think, white comedy writers, is like, ooh, here's our chance to be bad, because that's like a weird thing with white people, and it's like, here's our chance to like say one more fucking horrible thing.
No, you're absolutely right. That is a tendency, yeah. I think, of specifically male comedy writers as well.
Yes.
Which is like it's that kind of like 8th grade mentality of hearing something
boys
bad
with
in
their
the
toys.
Yeah.
And so I think what we did was we put a real firewall with that and said we need to figure out, and that's the challenge, is how do we represent him, but he must always be the butt of the joke. He must always be the one who's presenting the ignorance. When I'm not in character, but I'm at work, but I've been playing him for 3 years. So there's a bit of bleed that's starting to happen. So once in a while, I will kind of be like, wow, I'll kind of be, in my voice, find myself behaving like him unconsciously. And that's when I'm have to kind of step back. And it happened more during the series because we were running hot every week, and so therefore I'm in him 2 or 3 times a week, which doesn't sound like a good sentence. And with the Forbes. Just lube up the Forbes,
Right.
put it right in there. And so that's that answer. Does that help?
Isn't that wonderful during the 60 Minutes interview? I mean, I didn't really care that much about either the Stormy interview or the Karen McDougal interview. It's like, what we know this. But when they opened the interview with her being like, I spanked him with a magazine with his face on it, I giggled like a little kid. I thought it was so funny.
See, it's funny. Here's the things I care about in that. I care about the fact that he says, you look like my daughter, because I find that very interesting. I also find it interesting that he offered to pay McDougal, and she didn't want it. And I thought, what a sad, God, that's sad. It's sad. And I think that if you really, truly, you know, I know this is a hard thing to say or to hear, but sympathy, we need to really distinguish our notions of sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is within it an endorsement. I'm sympathetic to you because I endorse you. But empathy is the purest act that requires the most work, which is I'm empathetic with you, but I doesn't mean I agree with you, doesn't mean I have to like you, but I'm empathetic, you're a human being, and within that you have the human condition. And we have to have empathy with him because he is a human being. And through empathy comes understanding. And if you can understand someone, you can understand how to take them apart, right? So if I don't see him as a human, then I'm not, what am I doing? So to me, that's the most human, sad, that reveals so much about who he is and what his issues are with his mom and with women, which are clearly rooted deeply in being the second son to a more charismatic older brother who unfortunately had an alcohol problem and passed away, and he took on a brutal father and I think probably a wackadoo mom, and that was the home he grew up in. And clearly his sister got out early because she's like this like reasonable judge in the New York Superior Court. And I think that Trump is perceived as the sort of, you know, wacky family member that everyone just kind of ignored. And the Stormy Daniels thing that I find so interesting is him sitting at the edge of the bed like a kid, just waiting, you know? I mean, that's the thing is, if there's anything you could say about Donald Trump from those interviews, is he is a John. He is a true John. And for people who don't get that reference, you know, a John is, you know, a person who seeks out a sex worker. He is a John through and through. His behavior, everything he did, how he shows up. This is a guy who doesn't understand even what intimacy is. And that's sad.
Unless it's intimacy with himself.
Yes, but I'm sure that that discomfort is filled with food and TV and a bunch of other things. And I'm not saying here, you gotta like, I'm not going like, oh, I feel bad for him. I'm saying he's a human in pain. All humans in pain deserve that recognition because in that pain is the source and well of their hatred, the source of their bigotry. That's where it comes from. So wouldn't you want to know where that well is? You know? That's my point. Does somebody else have a question?
I think we have time for one more, and then I got to let you go right
Anthony.
here.
Hi. What's your name?
Michael.
Hi, Michael. I'm Anthony.
You kind of touched on this, but
I like that.
do you ever get tired of reading about Trump, watching Trump, being
Yes.
Trump? Like, how do you keep yourself sane?
Well, you know, it's funny. I think I went through a period where I dove real deep into it in the campaign and was actually, you know, pretty relatively entertained by his rallies because they were so insane and everything was sort of new. And so at that time, I was like, I could do it, you know, and I was working and, you know, in that sense, it's work, right? I try to keep it to work. I mean, to be quite frank, when I go home, it's PUBG on my Xbox X, or it's Sea of Thieves, which just came out, which is great. Or, you know, there's always a Real Housewives on. I mean, you know, New York's coming out pretty soon. Beverly Hills is wrapping up. You got Vanderpump. There's plenty.
So you're down to distract yourself with some of the light coming from the phone and the screens. As
Oh,
well.
I mean, listen, we're all hypocrites. We're all hypocrites, and I, you know, I'm a participant in the world, but that doesn't mean I can't recognize the damage it does. You know what I'm saying? Like is there anyone here who doesn't own a phone? Exactly. People hate child labor, right? Okay, square that with yourselves when you leave. Like, square it with yourself. How can you be so, like, I can't stand child labor, but I love my phone, which was made by children's hands. So, like, like, that's the world. The world is that we're in such a soup. Yeah. But the other thing, too, is I actually don't judge those things. I mean, if we want to go on a quick tip, I think Housewives has a weird sort of double-edged sword. So where else do you see women over 50 living their lives on television. You don't. Okay? Where's the room for women in this industry? It's very narrow. So to see 4 or 5 women in their 50s and 60s doing anything is astonishing. Okay? And so, yeah, of course, it's reality TV and it's all this other garbage, but I will go down with the ship when it comes to fucking housewives. So the point being is that I try to dip out and just be somewhere else when I'm home, and then I just make sure to read the paper in the morning, read the paper at night. I stay plenty well informed. But cable news also has so declined as something valuable at all that you can really get a first blush of it, you know, and be done with it. You don't really need to watch too much. Is that a good, long answer? You want me to keep talking?
No, that's good. I think I have to let you go. The Make America Great-A-Thon is April 3rd, right?
Make America Great-A-Thon is April 3rd at 11 p.m. on Comedy Central, and it is going to have incredible guests. There's really crazy, we've got a really crazy guest, and I can't say who it is, but it's going to be pretty wild, I think.
Can you give a hint?
No. We have some pre-taped segments there, a lot of fun, some of our field pieces, and it'll be fun. There'll be a phone number you can call and something saucy happening
be live?
on the other end. No.
Oh, okay.
No, it's a pre-recorded thing.
Anthony Atamanuik, everybody. Let's hear it.
Thank you. Great question. Thank you.